My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 31 years old now. Most people who meet me today describe me the same way. Calm, thoughtful, someone who listens carefully before speaking, someone who doesn't rush to fill silence, someone who seems comfortable staying in the background while others take the spotlight. They assume that composure came naturally to me. It didn't. What they see is the result, not the process. They don't see how long it took to learn when to speak, when to stay quiet, and how much it costs to get that balance wrong. They don't see the years spent unlearning a lesson I absorbed much too early. There was a time when I wasn't calm at all. There was a time when I believed that asking honest questions was not only allowed, but encouraged. When I thought curiosity was a strength, not a liability. When I assumed adults in authority positions wanted clarity as much as they wanted obedience. I was wrong. It took me years to understand that lesson fully, but it started on a single morning I still remember with uncomfortable precision. It was 8:42 a.m. on a gray, rainy day in late November. Not the dramatic kind of rain. No thunder, no urgency. Just a steady, patient drizzle that soaked everything slowly. The kind of rain that makes the world feel smaller, quieter, like it's pulling inward. I remember the smell first. Wet coats piled near the entrance, disinfectant clinging to the walls, old paper, something metallic beneath it all. I remember the sound of water sliding down tall windows, blurring the outside world until it felt unreachable, like whatever existed beyond the glass belonged to a different life. I was 16 years old, sitting alone at a long wooden table in a small room that was never used for anything good. Across from me sat 6 adults, teachers, administrators, people whose voices carried authority not because of what they said, but because of where they sat. None of them looked angry, none of them looked rushed. They were calm, composed. And that calm told me something before a single word was spoken. This meeting was not a discussion. The principal adjusted his glasses, glanced briefly at a folder in front of him, and said the institution had reached its limit with my behavior. He said it the way someone states the weather, neutral, final, as if it were a simple observation rather than a judgment. Behavior. That word echoed in my head, because even then, I didn't understand what it was supposed to mean. I had never been in a fight. I had never skipped class. I had never vandalized school property or disrupted lessons. I studied. I paid attention. I asked questions. And somehow, that was the problem. At the time, I thought maybe I had misunderstood something. Maybe I had crossed a line without realizing it. Adults were supposed to know better. Adults were supposed to be fair. That belief hadn't left me yet. I sat there listening as they spoke about patterns, concerns, and limits, none of which were ever defined clearly enough to challenge. Each sentence sounded reasonable on its own. Collected together, they formed something airtight. There was no accusation I could defend against, because nothing concrete was being accused. Years later, I would understand how intentional that vagueness was. But at 16, I was still trying to find the mistake I must have made. I searched my memory for moments that might explain why I was sitting in that room, while rain traced slow lines down the windows. The truth was that the trouble had started long before that meeting. It started quietly. It started the first time I noticed discomfort on a teacher's face when I raised my hand too often. My mathematics teacher was a woman who prided herself on order and precision. She liked clean lines, clear answers, predictable routines. Every lesson followed the same rhythm: write, solve, confirm, move on. Questions disrupted that rhythm. At first, she tolerated them. A tight smile, a quick answer, a subtle glance at the clock, but over time, that tolerance thinned. Every question felt to her like a challenge. Every follow-up felt like defiance. Once, she made a small mistake on the board. Nothing dramatic, just a number written slightly wrong. I pointed it out quietly, not to embarrass her, not to show off, just because I thought that was what students were supposed to do: participate, engage, improve understanding. She erased it without saying a word, but the air in the room changed. I felt it immediately, even if I didn't have language for it yet. A shift, a closing, like a door that had been open a moment earlier was now firmly shut. The following week, she handed back our tests. Mine was covered in red ink, 62%. I remember staring at the paper longer than necessary, trying to understand how something I felt confident about could suddenly be so wrong. I'd checked my answers twice. I'd followed the same steps she taught us. Nothing made sense. After class, I approached her desk and asked for clarification. She smiled. Not warmly, not cruelly, just enough to signal distance. She told me I should focus less on challenging authority and more on understanding my place. My place. I didn't know what my place was supposed to be, but I understood from her tone that it wasn't where I thought it was. From that moment on, things shifted slowly, almost invisibly. Grades dipped without explanation. Comments appeared in margins that felt vague but disapproving. Other teachers began to look at me differently, as if they had received information I hadn't. The history teacher once described me as arrogant in front of the class. The literature teacher suggested my essays were too advanced to be authentic, as if intelligence itself were suspicious. A label formed quietly, without anyone ever announcing it: problem student. Once that label exists, everything you do confirms it. If you speak, you're disruptive. If you stay quiet, you're withdrawn. There is no winning once the narrative is set. And I didn't know yet that narratives, once established inside institutions, are far more powerful than facts. By the time I realized something was wrong, it was already too late to reverse it. The label had settled, quietly, comfortably, like dust that no one bothers to clean because it doesn't seem urgent. And just like dust, it spread everywhere. Teachers who had never corrected my work before now circled sentences without explanation. Questions I asked in class were met with silence or redirected as if they had never been spoken. Sometimes a teacher would repeat my question themselves, rephrase it slightly, and then answer it. When that happened, the room would relax, the tension would lift. The problem hadn't been the question, it had been the source. I began to notice patterns I hadn't seen before, conversations that stopped when I entered a room, faculty meetings I was mentioned in but never invited to, a guidance counselor who suddenly suggested I consider managing expectations, despite my grades still being higher than most of my classmates. No one told me I was in trouble. That was the clever part. Trouble was implied. Suspicion was implied. Consequences were implied. Everything remained just vague enough to deny if challenged. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon. It was the kind of afternoon where the building felt restless, students counting minutes, teachers eager to finish, everyone leaning toward the weekend. I remember that because the atmosphere made what followed feel even more surreal. A fight broke out in the boys' bathroom. In this story, I wasn't there. I was in class. My attendance marked, my notebook open. The time stamp would have proven it. But facts were inconvenient, and someone needed a name. Mine was available. 2 witnesses came forward. Both claimed they had seen me enter the bathroom shortly before the fight. Both had connections to staff families. Both had reasons to dislike me that had nothing to do with the incident itself. I was never asked to explain. A staff member appeared at the classroom door and spoke my name. The way they said it told me this wasn't a question. I gathered my things under the watchful eyes of my classmates and followed them down the hallway. The walk felt longer than it was. Every step echoed. Lockers passed in a blur. I noticed how students avoided eye contact, not out of cruelty, but uncertainty. No one wants to be associated with a problem once the label is visible. I was told to wait. Hours passed. When I was finally called into the room with the wooden table and the rain-streaked windows, the decision had already been made. Adults discuss my future as if I were an inconvenience rather than a person. Words like pattern, escalation, and final warning were used with ease. They recommended immediate suspension. The speed of it stunned me. My mother was called. She arrived breathless, coat-soaked, hair damp from the rain. She looked smaller standing among them, not because she lacked strength, but because institutions have a way of shrinking individuals who stand alone. She asked what had happened. I couldn't explain it. Not because I didn't want to, but because nothing I said seemed to exist in the same version of reality they were operating in. The more I spoke, the more confused she looked. Not because she doubted me, but because the situation itself made no sense. For the first time, I saw doubt in her eyes, directed not at me, but at the world around us. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I could hear my mother crying softly in the kitchen, thinking I was asleep. That sound stayed with me. It stripped away whatever innocence I had left about how fairness was supposed to work. I didn't feel rage. I felt something colder, resolve. I promised myself I would understand how this happened, not just to me, but to others, and I promised that one day this kind of quiet destruction wouldn't feel so invisible. I was transferred to another school. My file followed me. Behavioral concerns, authority issues, words that sounded official enough to close doors before they ever opened. But away from that environment, something unexpected happened. Teachers listened. When I asked questions, they were answered instead of punished. When I corrected mistakes, I was thanked instead of watched. My grades improved. My confidence returned, slowly and cautiously, like an animal stepping back into open space after being cornered for too long. That was when the realization began to form. The problem had never been curiosity. The problem was power that couldn't tolerate being questioned. Years passed. In this story, I studied law, not because I dreamed of courtrooms or arguments, but because I wanted to understand systems, how they protect themselves, how they define what is normal and what is dangerous, how silence can be enforced without anyone ever raising their voice. 12 years later, I walked back into that same building, same hallway, same smell of old paper and cleaning chemicals. But this time, I wasn't a student. I was there in a professional capacity, asked to review institutional complaints as part of a fictional process. The irony wasn't lost on me. When one of my former teachers saw me, her face went pale. She whispered my name. I corrected her politely. And in that moment, I realized she understood something I had only just begun to grasp. The past doesn't disappear just because enough time passes. At first, I believed this was still about me, about closing an old wound, about confronting something unresolved. I couldn't have been more wrong. Once people realized I was willing to listen, messages began arriving, quietly, late at night, often anonymously. Some were only a few lines long, others were pages, confessions written carefully, as if the writers were afraid that too much emotion might make their experience invalid. What struck me wasn't anger, it was restraint. People weren't demanding revenge. They weren't naming villains. They were simply describing moments that had stayed with them for years, being warned not to ask certain questions, being told they were becoming too visible, being praised for intelligence in a way that sounded more like a threat than a compliment. Each message felt familiar, even when the details were different. Parents wrote too. Some apologized for not noticing sooner. Others admitted they had noticed something was wrong, but didn't know how to challenge the institution without risking their child's future. That fear appeared again and again, consequences that were never clearly defined but always implied. As I listened, a pattern emerged. Students weren't being punished for breaking rules. They were being managed, redirected, contained. The goal wasn't discipline, it was control. I began reviewing archived materials as part of my role, meeting summaries, internal notes, procedural language, nothing that screamed wrongdoing on its own. But repetition has a way of revealing truth. Certain phrases appeared again and again, across years and across staff members, as if they had been taught somewhere and quietly absorbed. Students displaying excessive influence should be monitored. Prolonged questioning may indicate authority resistance. Escalation should remain discreet. Authority resistance. That phrase stayed with me. It reframed curiosity as defiance, thought as disruption, influence as danger. The more I read, the more I understood how carefully the language avoided responsibility. No one ever wrote that a student should be silenced. They wrote about preserving balance, maintaining order, protecting the learning environment. The words sounded reasonable. That was the most unsettling part. The more I read, the clearer it became why it had taken me so long to understand what had happened to me as a student. Systems like this don't rely on cruelty. They don't need to. Cruelty draws attention. It creates resistance. What they rely on instead is plausibility, on actions that can always be justified individually, even when the cumulative effect is deeply damaging. No single teacher believed they were doing harm. No single administrator felt responsible for outcomes beyond their immediate role. Everyone was simply following procedure, preserving stability, maintaining order. And stability, I learned, often means keeping discomfort contained. As weeks passed, the atmosphere around my work began to change. Meetings that had once been easy to schedule were postponed. Emails were answered more slowly. Conversations became shorter, more cautious. People stopped volunteering information. No one told me to stop. No one needed to. Silence, when applied patiently, is an effective deterrent. At the same time, the public narrative began to shift. Articles that had initially focused on the experiences being shared slowly redirected their attention toward me. My background, my motivations, my emotional proximity to the issue. Nothing false was stated outright. There were no direct accusations, just questions. Was I too close to the subject? Was I projecting unresolved resentment? Was this a personal grievance disguised as concern? I recognized the strategy immediately. If the messenger can be questioned, the message becomes optional. The moment it became clear to me was during a short interview I agreed to do. I believed it would be an opportunity to redirect attention back to the stories, to the patterns, to the people who had spoken carefully and at personal cost. Instead, the questions circled me. Why now? Why this institution? Why someone with my history? I answered calmly. I chose my words carefully. I emphasized the consistency across accounts, the restraint in language, the absence of sensationalism. I spoke slowly, intentionally, believing that clarity would protect the work. When the segment aired, I barely recognized myself. My explanations were gone, my pauses edited into intensity. What remained was a version of me that looked fixated, unable to let go of the past. A man driven more by emotion than evidence. I watched it once, then I turned the screen off. That was when doubt arrived, not all at once, not dramatically. It settled in quietly, like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying until it shifted. Late at night, alone with my notes, I wondered whether I was seeing patterns where there were none, whether my past had shaped my interpretation more than I realized, whether I had crossed the line from observation into projection. The most dangerous doubt is the kind that sounds reasonable. It doesn't shout, it doesn't accuse. It simply asks whether you might be wrong, and when you care about being fair, that question is difficult to silence. What steadied me were the messages that continued to arrive, even as others stopped. One person wrote that reading my words made them feel less alone for the first time in years. Another said they had always believed they were weak until they saw their experience reflected in someone else's account. They weren't asking me to fix anything. They weren't demanding outcomes. They were thanking me for listening. Those messages reminded me that even if institutions never acknowledged the pattern, the people living inside it already recognized it. Validation doesn't always come from authority. Sometimes it comes from recognition. Still, the cost of continuing became harder to ignore. Sleep came in fragments. Conversations with my mother grew tense with worry. She asked me once, gently, whether this was hurting me. I didn't know how to answer honestly without frightening her. There were days when I considered stepping back. Not because I believed the work was wrong, but because I was exhausted. Systems like this don't defeat opposition with force. They wait. They stretch time until resolve thins out on its own. One evening, I sat alone in my office, holding a folder that contained everything I had gathered so far. Documents, statements, patterns carefully traced across years. I imagined closing it, ending the process quietly, letting the narrative move on without me. No confrontation, no final statement, just absence. The relief I felt at that thought scared me more than anything else. Then my phone buzzed. A short message from someone who had written earlier. It said, "If you stop now, they'll be right about us." I sat there for a long time after reading that sentence, because it contained a truth I couldn't escape. Silence wouldn't be interpreted as complexity. It would be interpreted as confirmation. The next morning I continued, not louder, not angrier, just steadier. I submitted documentation, responded carefully to questions, declined interviews that framed the issue as personal conflict, refused to engage with attacks on my character. If the narrative was going to shift, I wouldn't help it by reacting. Eventually, I was called into what was presented as a final internal meeting. A small room, neutral expressions, no hostility, just formality. Timelines were reviewed. Language was discussed. Interpretations weighed. Everything remained abstract, distant from the people whose experiences had initiated the process. Near the end, one person asked a question that cut through everything else. What outcome was I actually seeking? I took my time answering. I said I wasn't seeking punishment, not exposure for its own sake. I said I wanted the pattern to stop, enough interruption to make repetition harder, enough awareness to slow the mechanism down. They exchanged glances. Then they offered closure. A report would be written, language softened, findings reframed, no direct blame assigned. The system would remain intact, but the process would conclude. I understood what they were offering, not silence, acceptance. Acceptance that discomfort was the cost of order, that some stories would always be easier to manage than address. I declined, calmly, completely. The meeting ended shortly after. I walked out believing I had lost. There was a period after that when nothing seemed to move at all. No confrontations, no meetings, no decisive moments, just time. Days passed where I woke up already tired, not from lack of sleep, but from anticipation, from waiting for something that never quite arrived. I checked my phone more often than I needed to. I reread emails that said nothing new, searching for meaning in neutral language. Silence has a strange effect on the mind. At first, it feels like relief. Then it feels like neglect. Eventually, it starts to feel personal. I began replaying moments from the past, not intentionally, but involuntarily. Conversations I'd already analyzed countless times resurfaced again, slightly altered by memory. I noticed details I hadn't focused on before, tone shifts, pauses, the way certain questions were never answered directly. I asked myself whether I had misunderstood things back then, whether my interpretation had been shaped by youth, by sensitivity, by ego. That line of thinking was dangerous, and I knew it, but knowing doesn't always stop it. There were mornings when I sat at my desk and stared at the same sentence for 20 minutes, without writing a word. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was afraid of saying too much, or worse, saying something that could be reframed. I realized how deeply caution had embedded itself into me. Even now, I began noticing how often I softened my language, how frequently I added qualifiers. Maybe, possibly, it could be interpreted, as if clarity itself were something that needed permission. That realization unsettled me more than any institutional response ever had, because it meant the system didn't need to silence me anymore. I had learned to do part of the work myself. There were moments when anger surfaced unexpectedly. Not loud, explosive anger, but a tight, contained version that sat in my chest and made breathing feel shallow. I would notice it while standing in line at a coffee shop, or while listening to someone speak confidently about fairness and opportunity. Those moments reminded me that unresolved experiences don't disappear. They simply wait for the right context to make themselves known. I thought often about the students who had written to me, about how carefully they chose their words, about how often they apologized for taking up space in a message that was literally meant to be read. I recognized that instinct, that need to justify your own voice before using it. At night, when everything was quiet, I wondered how many people were still sitting in rooms like the one I remembered. Long tables, neutral expressions, calm voices delivering conclusions that felt irreversible, and I wondered how many of them would later question their own memory of what happened, simply because no one had confirmed it. That thought stayed with me. I also noticed something else during that period of waiting. People around me began acting as if the situation had already resolved. Conversations shifted naturally. They stopped asking questions. They stopped checking in, not because they were indifferent, but because unresolved tension makes people uncomfortable, and resolution, real or imagined, is easier to live with. I understood then how easily unresolved harm gets buried, not by denial, by convenience. There was a moment, late one evening, when I almost convinced myself that continuing didn't matter anymore, that whatever change was going to happen had already happened, that pressing further would only reopen something everyone else was ready to close. That argument was persuasive. It appealed to exhaustion, to reason, to the desire to move on. I remember standing by the window in my apartment, looking out at the city lights, thinking about how quiet everything looked from a distance, how conflict always seems smaller when you're not inside it. I asked myself whether I was holding on to something unnecessarily, whether this was pride disguised as principle. That question lingered longer than I wanted it to, and then, unexpectedly, clarity came from an ordinary place. I was reading through an old message I had saved earlier, one I hadn't responded to at the time. It was short, almost cautious. The person didn't describe an event. They described a feeling. They wrote that for years they believed they were fundamentally difficult, that something about them created friction wherever they went, and that only later did they realize the friction wasn't internal, it was relational. Reading that, something shifted, because I remembered thinking the same thing at 16. I remembered believing that I must have been the common denominator, that if authority reacted this way to me, the problem must be me. That belief had followed me quietly for years, shaping how I navigated rooms, conversations, expectations. And suddenly the waiting didn't feel neutral anymore. It felt complicit. I understood then that the danger wasn't that nothing was happening. The danger was that something had happened long ago, and its effects were still echoing quietly through people's lives. That realization didn't make things easier, but it made them clearer, and clarity, once it arrives, is difficult to ignore. After that meeting, everything became very quiet. No emails, no follow-ups, no explanations. The process didn't end with a clear conclusion. It simply stopped acknowledging my presence. I wasn't dismissed. I wasn't thanked. I was slowly removed from relevance, which felt intentional in a way that was difficult to prove. At first, I kept waiting for something to happen, a response, a consequence, some sign that the refusal had mattered. Nothing came. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The silence stretched until it began to feel heavier than confrontation ever could have been. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't aggressive, it was just empty. I returned to my routine, work continued, life moved forward on the surface, but internally, something felt unresolved. I had believed that taking a stand would bring clarity. Instead, it brought ambiguity. There were moments when I wondered if I had miscalculated, if refusing had been symbolic but ineffective, if acceptance would have achieved more in the long run. That uncertainty lingered, and then quietly, things began to shift. Not publicly, not dramatically, in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. I noticed changes in language first. Documents released months later used different phrasing. Authority resistance disappeared, replaced by engagement challenges. Disruption became unmet support needs. It wasn't accountability, but it was movement. Policies were revised subtly. New oversight steps introduced. Review committees expanded by a single external voice. Small adjustments that wouldn't make headlines, but would change how decisions were justified internally. No one referenced my work. No one credited the process. And yet, the pattern had been interrupted. At first, I resisted calling that a result. It felt unsatisfying, incomplete, like an ending without acknowledgement. But messages began arriving again, not about investigations, not about institutions, about lives. Lucas wrote to tell me he had enrolled in night classes. He said he had stopped thinking he was broken. A mother sent a brief message thanking me for listening. She said that had mattered more than any formal outcome. Someone else wrote that they had finally spoken to their child without dismissing their frustration. That conversation, they said, had changed everything. Those messages didn't announce justice. They reflected relief. And that was when I understood, something I hadn't before. Justice doesn't always arrive as exposure. Sometimes it arrives as interruption, as a shift so subtle it almost goes unnoticed, but strong enough to redirect momentum, strong enough to change trajectories. I still walk past schools sometimes. I hear bells ring. Students argue loudly about things that feel enormous in the moment. Teachers hurry down hallways carrying stacks of papers and expectations. And I wonder how many voices will be protected, and how many will still need someone to listen. I think often about that 16-year-old version of myself sitting in a small room with rain on the windows, about how small he felt, how confused, how certain he was that he had somehow failed without knowing how. For a long time, I tried to distance myself from him, as if growth required forgetting. Now I understand that growth required listening to him instead. He wasn't wrong, he wasn't broken. He was simply ahead of a system that didn't know how to respond without tightening its grip. After everything slowed down, after the meetings ended and the messages became less frequent, I expected to feel empty. I didn't. What I felt instead was awareness, a quiet, persistent awareness of how power works when it isn't questioned, of how easily silence is mistaken for harmony, of how often curiosity is framed as danger simply because it exposes weakness. I noticed changes in myself. I spoke more deliberately. I listened longer. I paid attention to who felt comfortable in a room and who didn't. Sometimes I wondered whether that was wisdom or damage. It took time to understand that it was both. There were nights when memories resurfaced without warning, not dramatic scenes, small moments, a teacher pausing before answering, a classmate lowering his voice to warn me to be careful, a door closing softly behind me after a meeting that had felt polite but final. Those memories didn't hurt the way they once had. They felt explanatory. I started writing again. Not reports, not documentation, just reflections. I wrote about being praised for intelligence and punished for using it, about how authority rarely announces itself as oppression, about how concern can be used as a weapon when it isn't open to dialogue. As I wrote, I realized how many of my adult behaviors had grown out of that early experience. My need to anticipate reactions, my habit of softening statements before making them, my instinct to scan rooms for approval or resistance. None of it had been conscious. It had simply become normal. Understanding that didn't erase it, but it gave it shape. And once something has shape, it can be examined instead of feared. Occasionally, updates arrive from people I had spoken to earlier, not about the institution, about themselves, a class completed, a conversation finally had, a belief released. One message stayed with me. Someone wrote that they had always believed their silence was weakness. Now they understood it had been survival. That distinction mattered. It changed how they saw themselves. And in reading that, I felt something loosen inside me that I hadn't realized was still tight. I no longer saw authority with hostility. I saw it with clarity. I no longer assumed it was right by default or malicious by nature. I saw it as human, shaped by fear, habit, and self-preservation. That understanding didn't excuse harm, but it explained how easily it could happen without anyone feeling guilty. I learned when to step in and when to step back. Not every system can be changed from the inside. Not every pattern can be interrupted by one person. Knowing the difference became its own kind of wisdom. Sometimes people ask whether it was worth it, whether all the tension, doubt, and exhaustion led to something measurable. I don't always know how to answer. Change rarely looks the way we imagine it will. It doesn't arrive with clear endings or public acknowledgement. Often it shows up as absence, as something that doesn't happen again. What I do know is this: silence protects systems. Speech disrupts them, even when it's quiet, especially when it's quiet. I was once the student they tried to silence, not because I was dangerous, but because I wouldn't stop thinking out loud. That part of me never disappeared. It just learned how to survive, and that still matters. After everything settled, after the silence stopped feeling heavy and started feeling normal, I thought the story was over. That's what we're taught to believe, that stories end when the conflict fades, when the system absorbs the disruption and moves on. But real stories don't end like that. They don't close with certainty. They linger. Months passed. Life returned to something that resembled balance. I worked. I slept better. Conversations stopped circling the same questions. People stopped asking what had happened and started asking what I was doing next. I didn't always know how to answer, because the truth was, nothing dramatic came next. No new fight, no next battle, just a quieter awareness that stayed with me wherever I went. I noticed it in meetings, when someone spoke and the room reacted not to the idea, but to the person delivering it. I noticed it in classrooms I occasionally visited, when certain students leaned forward while others learned to lean back. I noticed it in myself, when I hesitated before asking a question, even years after promising myself I never would again. That hesitation wasn't fear, it was memory. Memory of how quickly curiosity can be reframed, how easily intention can be rewritten by those who hold the narrative. For a long time, I believed the most dangerous thing a system could do was punish someone openly. I was wrong. The most dangerous thing it can do is convince you that nothing happened, that what you felt was exaggeration, that your discomfort was immaturity, that your questions were the real problem. Once that belief takes root, control becomes invisible, and invisible control is the hardest to challenge. Every now and then, I receive messages from people who never contacted me before. They don't reference reports or policies. They don't ask for help. They simply say things like, "I heard your story," or "something you said stayed with me." Sometimes they share a moment, a teacher who shut them down gently but repeatedly, a supervisor who praised them publicly but undermined them privately, a space where being thoughtful felt like being risky. I never tell them what to do. I don't offer strategies or solutions. I listen, because listening was the thing so many of us were denied when it mattered most. Over time, I stopped seeing my experience as an exception. It wasn't unusual, it was simply early. Early exposure to a pattern most people don't recognize until much later, if they recognize it at all. That understanding softened something in me. I no longer needed vindication. I no longer needed acknowledgement from the system itself. What mattered was recognition from others, from myself. I think back often to that 16-year-old sitting at a long wooden table, rain sliding down the windows, surrounded by calm voices, delivering a decision that felt permanent. I wish I could tell him what I know now, that the calm wasn't certainty, that the confidence wasn't truth, that being questioned didn't mean he was wrong, he was simply inconvenient. And inconvenience in rigid systems is often treated as danger. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you were ever told that your questions made people uncomfortable, that your presence disrupted balance, that your voice was too much, understand this. Discomfort is often the first signal that something important has been touched. Curiosity isn't a flaw. Influence isn't a threat. And silence isn't proof that nothing happened. Sometimes silence is the goal. I was once the student they tried to silence. Not because I was dangerous, but because I kept asking questions they couldn't answer without changing. That part of me never disappeared. It adapted. It learned restraint. It learned timing. But it never stopped listening. And that still matters. Because stories like this don't exist to accuse. They exist to remind. To remind you that if something felt wrong, it probably was. That if you were made smaller for thinking, that wasn't growth. And that your voice didn't lose value just because someone taught you to lower it. The system may never say it out loud, so I will. You weren't the problem, you never were. And that's where this story ends. Stories like this happen more often than we think. Subscribe if you want to hear the ones that usually stay unspoken. And if this story made you pause, a like helps the channel grow.